The Imperium teaches that the Emperor of mankind was beyond such weakness. That he stood above emotion, above doubt, above hesitation. A being forged not merely of flesh and mind, but of purpose so absolute that fear had no place within it. Fear, after all, is for mortals, those who do not see the path ahead, those who stumble in darkness and uncertainty. And yet, buried beneath 10,000 years of censored histories and carefully sculpted myths, there exists a truth so uncomfortable that it was never meant to be spoken aloud. The Emperor did feel fear. Not the shrieking terror of panic or the trembling dread of defeat, but something far more dangerous. He felt fear of inevitability. Because fear, in its purest form, is not an emotion. It is a calculation. The Emperor saw the galaxy as a vast equation, countless variables moving through time, branching into futures that only he could perceive. Civilizations rose and fell in his mind long before they did in reality. Wars were already won or lost before the first shot was fired. To him, chaos was not a mystery, but a known constant. Zeno's empires were obstacles to be removed. Even treachery among his own sons was something he anticipated, planned for, and accepted as a necessary cost of shaping humanity's destiny. These were dangers, yes, but they were predictable dangers. They followed patterns. They obeyed rules. What the Emperor feared was not destruction. What he feared was replacement. From the very beginning, the Primarchs were not created as sons in the way mortals understand the word. They were instruments, living archetypes forged to embody specific aspects of humanity. Each one represented a controlled extreme, unmatched wrath, flawless logic, unbreakable endurance, unyielding faith. They were weapons shaped with precision, designed to conquer a galaxy and then, in time, to fade into legend once their purpose was fulfilled. None of them were meant to surpass the Emperor. None of them were meant to question him. And certainly, none of them were meant to become something humanity might one day choose over him. But one did. Imperial records never say this directly. They never would. Instead, they speak in omissions, in contradictions, in strange silences where detail should exist. Campaigns are summarized too briefly. Achievements are praised, but never examined. Philosophies are referenced, but never explained. It is as if the scribes themselves sensed that to write too much would be to invite something dangerous, something that could not be undone once understood. And so, history learned to look away. This story is not about rebellion. It is not about corruption or betrayal. It is not about a Primarch who turned against his father in rage or ambition. Those stories are familiar, comfortable, even. They allow the Imperium to believe that the greatest threats always come from without, or from obvious weakness within. This story is far more unsettling, because it speaks of a Primarch who did everything right, yet frightened the Emperor more than any traitor ever could. Because he did not threaten the Imperium with fire and blood. He threatened it with a future. In the quiet moments, when the Emperor's gaze moved beyond the present and into the branching possibilities of what humanity could become, there was one presence that refused to resolve itself. Where other Primarchs appeared as fixed points, destined to fall, to die, or to fade, this one existed as a blur. A distortion in the Emperor's foresight. A variable that refused to obey the rules of the equation. No matter how many futures the Emperor examined, no matter how far he extended his vision, the same uncertainty remained. In some timelines, this sun stood beside him, guiding humanity into an age where gods were no longer needed. In others, humanity followed that sun alone, leaving the Emperor behind, not in hatred, but in gratitude. And in every future where that happened, the Emperor was no longer necessary. That was the fear he never spoke of. Not that this Primarch would destroy him, but that he would render him obsolete. That humanity, given a choice, might outgrow the God who claimed to be its savior. And so the Emperor did what he always did when faced with an unacceptable future. He did not confront it openly. He did not name it. He did not strike it down. He buried it, because some truths are more dangerous than heresy. And some sons are more terrifying than traitors, not because they wish to tear the Imperium apart, but because they might succeed in building something better. Before we can understand why the Emperor feared one Primarch above all others, we must first understand what the Primarchs were truly meant to be. Not the legends recited by the ecclesiarchy, not the heroic figures carved into cathedral walls, but the cold intention behind their creation. Because the Emperor did not build the Primarchs out of affection, nor out of pride. He built them because humanity, in his eyes, could not survive without monsters wearing human faces. The galaxy the Emperor sought to conquer was already broken. Old Night had shattered civilizations, isolated worlds, and reduced humanity to superstition and barbarism. Warp storms cut entire systems off for generations, while alien empires rose to feast on the remnants. The Emperor looked upon this chaos and reached a single conclusion: humanity would either be united under absolute control, or it would be extinguished. There would be no gentle path forward. No democratic awakening. No slow evolution into enlightenment. Survival demanded speed, force, and obedience. That was the gamble. The Primarchs were designed as solutions, each one tailored to eliminate a specific weakness in humanity's march toward galactic dominance. Where humans were fragile, the Primarchs were indestructible. Where humans doubted, the Primarchs acted with certainty. Where humans argued, the Primarchs commanded. They were not meant to debate the Emperor's vision. They were meant to execute it, flawlessly, relentlessly, and without hesitation. And for most of them, that design worked exactly as intended. Each Primarch reflected a controlled extreme of the human condition. Rage harnessed into conquest, logic sharpened into domination, faith weaponized into unity. Even their flaws were intentional, because flaws could be predicted, guided, and ultimately exploited. The Emperor understood that perfection was brittle, but extremes were manageable. You could point them at an enemy and know precisely what they would do. You could chart their behavior. You could plan around their nature. What the Emperor did not intend, what he could not afford, was a Primarch who inspired reflection instead of obedience. From the outside, the Great Crusade appeared unstoppable. Legion after legion reclaimed lost human worlds, bringing them back into compliance beneath the imperial banner. To the common citizen, it looked like salvation. To historians, it would later be recorded as destiny fulfilled. But beneath the triumph, the Emperor watched closely. He observed how each Primarch ruled when left alone. How they treated compliance not just as conquest, but as philosophy. How they spoke to newly reunited humans, not as subjects but as people. And it was there, in those quiet moments far from Terra, that one Primarch began to stand apart. Not through rebellion, not through arrogance, but through questions. This Primarch did not simply conquer worlds, he changed them. He did not demand worship, nor blind loyalty. Instead, he left behind populations that understood why they were now part of the Imperium. Worlds that did not fear the Emperor, but believed in the future he promised. And belief, unlike fear, has a way of spreading on its own. That was the first warning sign. The Emperor had always intended to be humanity's guiding force, at least until it was strong enough to stand on its own. But this son did not speak of guidance. He spoke of growth. He did not position himself as a ruler above humanity, but as proof of what humanity could one day become. And that idea, quiet, reasonable, and deeply persuasive, was more dangerous than any open defiance. If you're still with me, here's the reward for watching until the end of this story. You'll understand why the Emperor's greatest enemy was never chaos, never Horus, and never the traitor legions, but the possibility that humanity might one day no longer need a god at all. Because once that idea takes root, no empire, no matter how powerful, can survive it unchanged. For the Emperor of mankind, fear was never a sudden reaction. It was never panic, never hesitation, never the instinct to flee. His fear was quiet, methodical, and devastatingly rational. It emerged not as emotion, but as awareness, the recognition that a particular outcome existed, and that no amount of power could fully erase its possibility. To fear, for the emperor, was to acknowledge a flaw in the grand design. This is where most people misunderstand him. They imagine fear as weakness, as doubt, as something unbecoming of a god. But the emperor's fear was closer to mathematics than emotion. It was probability made manifest. He could tolerate risk. He could tolerate loss. He could even tolerate betrayal. What he could not tolerate was uncertainty, especially the kind that spread rather than exploded. Chaos was dangerous, but it was crude. It corrupted openly, violently, predictably. The emperor understood chaos because chaos behaved exactly as it always had. It preyed on excess, despair, ambition, and faith. Its victories were spectacular, but ultimately self-defeating. Chaos burned everything it touched, including itself. In the emperor's calculations, that made it manageable. A storm, no matter how violent, eventually burns itself out. The same was true of the traitors who would later rise against him. Horus was devastating, but Horus was also comprehensible. His fall followed a familiar arc: pride, manipulation, resentment. The emperor had seen that story play out across civilizations long before the Primarchs were ever born. Horus was a tragedy, yes, but not a surprise. And surprises were what truly concerned the emperor. Because this fear, the fear that mattered, did not come from corruption or rebellion. It came from choice. The Primarch the emperor feared most never sought to overthrow him. Never raised a banner against Terra. Never declared independence or questioned the Imperium through violence. Instead, he demonstrated something far more dangerous, that loyalty and divergence could coexist. That obedience did not require submission of thought. That humanity could be united without being diminished. This was not a threat the emperor could crush with legions. It was an idea. And ideas are uniquely terrifying to those who rule through inevitability. Where other Primarchs inspired awe, this one inspired understanding. Where others ruled through presence and dominance, he ruled through explanation and example. Populations complied not because they were afraid of the Imperium's power, but because they believed compliance was rational. That belief mattered. It meant that loyalty did not end when the armies departed. It meant the Imperium endured without constant enforcement. On the surface, this looked like success, perhaps even perfection. But to the emperor, it represented a dangerous shift. Because if people followed the Imperium because it made sense, then one day they might decide it no longer did. And if that day came, they would not need chaos to rebel. They would not need violence. They would simply move on. That was the future the emperor could not fully see. In his visions, empires always fell the same way, through war, corruption, or decay. But this future was different. In it, humanity did not rage against its God. It thanked him, honored him, then surpassed him. And there is no greater fear to a creator than the possibility that his creation might outgrow the need for him entirely. So the emperor watched. He did not accuse. He did not intervene openly. Instead, he observed this Primarch more closely than any other, measuring every decision, every word, every outcome. Because somewhere within those quiet victories and reasonable reforms, the emperor sensed the outline of a future he had not authorized. And for the first time since the dawn of the Great Crusade, the emperor was not certain that the future belonged to him alone. The emperor had designed the Primarchs to be finite solutions to an infinite problem. They were meant to conquer the galaxy quickly, decisively, and then step aside once humanity was secure. None of them were intended to define the future beyond the battlefield. That responsibility, guiding humanity through what came after, was always meant to belong to the emperor alone. And yet, with this Primarch, that boundary began to blur. Unlike his brothers, he did not treat the Great Crusade as an end in itself. Victory, for him, was never enough. After compliance was achieved, he lingered. He studied the worlds he reclaimed, the cultures he absorbed, the people who would have to live with the consequences of imperial rule long after the fleets moved on. He asked what would remain when the banners were lowered and the legions were gone. And more dangerously, he encouraged others to ask the same question. This was not defiance, it was curiosity. To the Imperium, curiosity was tolerated only when it served conquest. The Emperor himself was proof of that. His mastery of science, genecraft, and forbidden knowledge had reshaped humanity. But the Emperor's curiosity was centralized, controlled. His sons were not meant to share in it. They were meant to act, not to reflect. And yet this Primarch reflected constantly, not just on how to win wars, but on whether the shape of those victories would endure. Among his legion, this thinking took root. Officers began to plan not just campaigns, but governance. Warriors debated philosophy alongside strategy. Compliance was achieved with fewer massacres, fewer forced relocations, fewer worlds left simmering with resentment. To the administratum, the numbers looked ideal. To the Emperor, the pattern behind those numbers was deeply unsettling. Because this was not efficiency born of brutality. It was efficiency born of consent. Other Primarchs inspired loyalty through legend. This one inspired it through reason. He spoke openly of a future where humanity would no longer need Primarchs, Astartes, or even the Emperor himself to dictate its fate. Not as a challenge, but as an aspiration. A distant goal, perhaps centuries away, but one that was spoken of aloud. And words, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. The Emperor understood immediately what that meant. A Primarch who believed in his own obsolescence was not dangerous. But a Primarch who believed in the obsolescence of gods, that was something else entirely. That was a seed that could grow long after the Emperor was gone, reshaping humanity in ways no prophecy could fully contain. This was the moment the Emperor began to adjust. He did not confront the Primarch directly. There were no accusations, no rebukes. Instead, certain requests went unanswered. Certain resources arrived late, or not at all. Campaigns that should have been entrusted to this son were quietly reassigned. Praise became measured. Recognition grew distant. To the wider Imperium, nothing appeared wrong. But between father and son, a silent understanding began to form. The Primarch noticed. He was not blind to the shift, nor naive enough to misunderstand it. He understood what the Emperor feared, even if the Emperor would never name it. And rather than retreat, he chose something far more dangerous. He accepted the limitation. He adapted. He proved that his vision did not depend on favor, authority, or proximity to Terra. Which only confirmed the Emperor's fear. Because power that thrives without reinforcement is power that cannot be easily controlled. And the Emperor began to realize that this son did not need permission to shape the future. He was already doing it, quietly, efficiently, and with the full belief of those who followed him. The war was still being won. But the future was slipping out of the Emperor's hands. The Emperor had always assumed that understanding flowed in one direction, from him to his sons, and from his sons to the rest of humanity. Knowledge was power, and power, in his design, was hierarchical. Even when the Primarchs exceeded mortal limits of intellect and perception, they were still meant to orbit him, never eclipse him. But with this Primarch, something unprecedented began to occur. He was not merely learning from the Emperor's teachings. He was extrapolating beyond them. In councils and war briefings, his observations went further than expected. He did not just identify problems, he traced them to their philosophical roots. He did not merely execute policy, he questioned whether the policy itself would survive the centuries to come. Other Primarchs dismissed this as overthinking, or worse, as weakness. But the Emperor listened, silently, and what he heard disturbed him deeply. Because the conclusions were sound. Again and again, this son demonstrated an understanding of humanity that was not grounded in control, but in trust. He recognized patterns the Emperor had discounted as inefficient: cooperation without coercion, loyalty without fear, unity without enforced worship. These were not ideals born of naivety. They were strategic observations, supported by results. Worlds governed under this Primarch's influence stabilized faster. Rebellions were rarer. Cultural erosion slowed instead of accelerating. Humanity, left with a degree of agency, did not collapse into chaos as the Emperor had long feared. It adapted. This directly challenged one of the Emperor's oldest assumptions, that humanity, if left to its own devices, would always self-destruct. That it required a singular, guiding will to survive the predations of the warp and the temptations of excess. The Emperor had built his entire galactic vision on that belief. To discover that it might be incomplete, perhaps even wrong, was not just uncomfortable. It was destabilizing. The Emperor began to see the danger not in what this Primarch did, but in what he represented. If one of his own creations could arrive at a more sustainable vision for humanity's future, then what did that imply about the Emperor himself? About the necessity of his eternal rule. About the price he was willing to make humanity pay in exchange for survival. These were not questions the Emperor allowed himself to ask. But his son did. And worse still, others began asking them too. Within the Primarch's legion, officers and warriors alike spoke of the Imperium not as an end state, but as a transition. A necessary phase in humanity's growth, not its final form. They spoke of a day when legions would no longer be needed, when governance would belong to humans unshackled from constant war. To most Imperials, these ideas would have sounded harmless, even hopeful. But to the Emperor, they rang like a warning bell echoing through time. Because hope, when directed away from a god, becomes competition. The Emperor's fear sharpened into resolve. He could not allow this philosophy to spread unchecked. Not because it was false, but because it was too convincing. And so, without ever issuing a formal decree, he ensured that the Primarch's influence remained localized. His victories were praised, but not celebrated. His methods were noted, but never codified. His ideas were allowed to exist, but never amplified. History, after all, is shaped as much by what is excluded as by what is recorded. The Primarch understood this as well. He saw the narrowing paths, the subtle isolation, the way his voice carried less weight in the grand councils of the Imperium. Yet he did not protest. He did not demand recognition. This was the unique fear the Emperor carried in silence, day after day, campaign after campaign. He did not fear open betrayal, or a war lost to an enemy at his doorstep. He feared inevitability, the kind that moves quietly, with logic and conviction, leaving no signs until it has already taken root. And the Primarch who inspired it was no ordinary son. He was the embodiment of possibility. The one who made the Emperor confront the stark realization that authority, no matter how absolute, is always fragile when ideas take hold. Unlike the other Primarchs, who crushed resistance through sheer force or manipulated it through fear, this son approached loyalty as a living thing. He taught his warriors that strength was not measured merely in victories or battlefield prowess, but in the consequences of choice. He allowed humanity to see its own potential. He guided them not by domination, but by reasoning that felt natural, inevitable, and deeply persuasive. What others demanded, he inspired. And inspiration, unlike obedience, cannot be legislated or enforced. Across every conquered world, people began to follow his principles, even in the absence of direct supervision. Civilians adopted systems of self-governance that persisted. Warriors internalized ethics that transcended orders. Populations thrived because they were empowered, not because they feared the whip or the sword. And with each world stabilized in this subtle way, the Emperor's control over the grand narrative weakened, not visibly, not overtly, but in ways his foresight could not fully account for. It was then that the Emperor realized the scope of the threat. Not the threat of war. Not the threat of rebellion. Not even the threat of heresy. The threat was philosophical. The threat was the Primarch's influence on the hearts and minds of humanity. He had created beings who could conquer the galaxy, but this son had created a being who could conquer ideas themselves. And ideas, once accepted, cannot be taken back by force. Worse, the Primarch did not even seem aware of the fear he inspired. He never sought to overshadow the Emperor, never declared independence, never raised a hand in defiance. He acted entirely within the boundaries of loyalty and duty, yet every measured action, every careful decision, chipped away at the Emperor's monopoly over humanity's destiny. Where others obeyed and followed, he shaped. And shaping is a power no legion, no fortress, and no god can fully contain. The Emperor responded as he always did, quietly, strategically. He began to adjust campaigns, subtly limit access, and divert attention elsewhere. Nothing overt, nothing confrontational, just a series of minor manipulations, enough to curb influence without provoking outright defiance. To any observer, it seemed as though the Emperor merely shifted resources or delegated responsibility. But beneath it all was calculation born of unease. And still, the Primarch persisted. Despite the limitations, despite the careful constraints, he continued to guide, to reason, and to inspire. He worked quietly, not out of rebellion, but out of the unshakable belief that humanity could be more than obedience. And that quiet persistence, the silent, patient demonstration of a better future, was what made him the only son the Emperor truly feared. Because power that does not seek recognition, yet spreads anyway, cannot be controlled. Influence that grows through reason, not force, cannot be erased. And the Emperor had built an empire of obedience, not thought. He was witnessing, in real time, the emergence of a force he could not command, and it terrified him. For the first time in millennia, the Emperor confronted the possibility that he might not be the final arbiter of humanity's destiny. That someone he had forged might one day show the galaxy that it no longer needed gods. And in that realization, the most absolute ruler in human history felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. The Primarch the Emperor feared did not act recklessly, nor did he crave glory. He understood the weight of his position, the magnitude of his own power, and the consequences of every decision. Yet, he possessed a rare quality, the ability to inspire without commanding. Unlike other sons who relied on intimidation, strategy, or overwhelming force, this Primarch wielded reason as his greatest weapon. And reason, when it spreads quietly, is far more dangerous than any blade or bolter. Within his legion, this quiet influence transformed the very culture of obedience. Officers began to question not out of disloyalty, but out of understanding. Soldiers internalized principles of ethics and governance alongside martial skill. Humanity, under his guidance, did not merely comply. It learned to anticipate, to choose, and to act with agency. The Emperor had designed obedience as the ultimate safeguard against the chaos of the galaxy. And now, he watched a son teach compliance without submission. The subtlety of this threat made it nearly invisible. From Terra, it appeared as perfect execution of the Emperor's grand design. Worlds reclaimed, legions disciplined, campaigns won. But beneath the surface, the Emperor could see the emerging anomaly. Where his influence had once been the central axis of humanity's trajectory, this Primarch created a parallel line of reasoning that did not need him to exist. A civilization guided by thought rather than by command. A society capable of acting with initiative instead of waiting for edicts. This was not rebellion. This was evolution. And evolution, in its quiet persistence, cannot be legislated away. The Emperor realized that he faced a choice: intervene directly, risk confrontation, and potentially fracture a son he had worked millennia to raise, or contain influence subtly, preserving the veneer of obedience while trying to maintain control. He chose the latter. Campaigns were quietly reassigned. Access to critical resources was limited. Praise was measured, recognition delayed. Every small adjustment was a calculated attempt to curb the Primarch's reach without provoking confrontation. But each adjustment was met with resilience. The Primarch did not retreat. He adapted. He found new ways to guide, to reason, and to influence. Every action, carefully observed by the Emperor, reaffirmed the same terrifying truth. This son could not be contained by hierarchy, by distance, or by command. He thrived within constraints. He inspired under limits. And in doing so, he exposed the Emperor's vulnerability, the realization that authority alone was not enough to shape humanity's future. The Emperor had faced legions that betrayed him. He had faced the horrors of the warp. He had faced gods who would have destroyed all of humanity if left unchecked. But none of these dangers were as frightening as the calm, measured influence of a son who had mastered not war, but the hearts and minds of those he led. Because true power, the kind that cannot be opposed, does not shout. It whispers. And the Emperor, in all his foresight and might, understood that the whisper had already begun to echo louder than any command. It was a power he could not strike down, a loyalty he could not break, and a future he could not fully predict. The Emperor feared what he could not control. And this son, this Primarch, was uncontrollable in the most profound way. By this point, the Emperor's unease had transformed into something sharper, an almost obsessive vigilance. Every campaign, every decision, every subtle innovation by this Primarch was scrutinized, not with anger, but with calculation. For the Emperor, the threat was not visible in open confrontation or military failure, it was woven into the very fabric of influence. This son's methods were invisible to the casual observer, yet devastating in their implications. He did not seize power. He shifted minds. Across conquered worlds, administrators and citizens alike began to adopt ways of thinking that challenged the status quo, without even realizing it. The Emperor had forged a galaxy where loyalty was enforced through hierarchy and fear. Yet this Primarch taught loyalty through reason. He showed humanity a path where duty was understood, not demanded. And the subtle difference terrified the Emperor. Because this path did not require conflict. It did not require armies or enforcement. It required only belief. And once belief takes root, it cannot be legislated away. The Emperor observed, silent and calculating, as the Primarch's influence grew despite the careful restrictions imposed. Campaigns that should have been limited flourished. His strategies, though subtly constrained, produced outcomes that were better than the Emperor could have predicted. It was as if this son had internalized the Emperor's vision, then improved upon it without ever challenging his authority outright. This realization forced the Emperor to confront an uncomfortable truth. This Primarch had become an anomaly within the framework of his creation. Every other son, even the most brilliant or rebellious, could be anticipated, controlled, or countered. But this one operated on a plane that blurred obedience with thought, loyalty with independence, service with understanding. He did not simply execute orders, he interpreted them, refined them, and extended their impact in ways the Emperor had never accounted for. It was a lesson in subtlety that no strategy, no gene craft, and no fleet could contain. And worse, the Emperor knew that the galaxy would eventually notice it too. Humanity, left with the freedom to reason and choose, might someday prioritize understanding over worship, principles over obedience, and truth over dogma. And in that moment, the Emperor would no longer be indispensable. For the first time in millennia, the Emperor realized that survival of the Imperium was no longer guaranteed by strength, foresight, or even loyalty. It was threatened by the quiet evolution of thought, the kind of evolution this son embodied. And while chaos, treachery, and xenos could be opposed with force, there was no weapon in the galaxy that could erase ideas once they had taken root. The Emperor had faced countless threats. He had orchestrated wars that reshaped star systems, survived betrayals that would have shattered lesser beings, and stared into the heart of the warp without flinching. Yet none of those challenges brought the same weight of dread as the one posed by his own son. Because this was not a son who might destroy the Imperium. This was a son who might outgrow it. The Emperor had always trusted in certainty. In his mind, the galaxy was an equation, a series of variables that could be controlled, predicted, and ultimately mastered. Wars could be calculated. Rebellions could be anticipated. Even the dangers of the warp, chaotic and infinite, could be managed with foresight and precision. But this Primarch introduced a variable the Emperor could not predict, and that, more than any weapon or legion, terrified him. Unlike his brothers, who could be measured in strength, obedience, or brutality, this son's influence was an abstract force. He shaped minds, not armies. He guided belief, not fear. And he did it without ever seeming to challenge authority. To an outsider, he was the perfect Primarch, brilliant, disciplined, loyal. But the Emperor, who could see the patterns of countless futures, recognized the anomaly. This Primarch did not simply participate in the equation, he altered it. He created new paths the Emperor could not anticipate, and in doing so, he exposed the cracks in the Emperor's vision. Every adjustment the Emperor made to contain him was met with subtle adaptation. Restrict a campaign, and the son found another way to achieve victory. Limit access to resources, and he optimized what little he had with unprecedented efficiency. Praise was withheld, recognition delayed, yet the Primarch continued to thrive. Quietly, patiently, and deliberately, he expanded influence without ever appearing to rebel. The Emperor understood why this was dangerous. Not because it would lead to immediate rebellion. Not because it challenged military authority. But because it suggested that humanity could operate independently of his oversight, that order could exist without the omnipotent hand of the Emperor directing every move. And once that realization took hold among the populations of the galaxy, no amount of power could fully reverse it. Ideas, once accepted, grow stronger with time. It was here, in the subtleties of influence and reasoning, that the Emperor confronted the essence of his fear. The other Primarchs, for all their brilliance and flaws, were predictable. They could be manipulated, corrected, or contained. They followed patterns he could understand. But this son was different. His strategies worked not because they were forced, but because they made sense. And the more sense they made, the more difficult it became to suppress them without appearing tyrannical. The Emperor began to see that his fear was not of open defiance but of inevitability. A future in which humanity could choose its path without him. A future where obedience was replaced by understanding, loyalty by respect, and reverence by reason. And in that future, the Emperor himself was no longer central, not through rebellion, not through chaos, but through quiet, unshakable logic. This was the moment when the Emperor realized something few ever consider. The most terrifying threats are not those that confront you directly, but those that make you irrelevant while appearing perfectly loyal. And this Primarch, his greatest creation, had mastered that form of power completely. The Emperor had long been the ultimate arbiter of humanity's fate. For millennia, he had guided, shaped, and controlled the galaxy with a precision that few could comprehend. The Primarchs were extensions of his will, living instruments designed to execute his vision with perfect fidelity. Yet this one son began to teach a different lesson entirely. That guidance did not always require absolute control, that power did not always demand fear, and that obedience could exist alongside independent thought. Across the stars, this Primarch quietly demonstrated a new paradigm. Worlds stabilized not because armies enforced order, but because citizens and administrators understood why the order was necessary. Warriors fought not solely out of command, but because they recognized the logic of strategy and the long-term benefits of their actions. Loyalty was no longer a reflex born of fear, it was a choice, reasoned and deliberate. And everywhere it spread, the Emperor's carefully constructed expectations began to shift. Other Primarchs had strength, cunning, or ambition. Some could inspire loyalty, others could dominate enemies, and still others could bring entire civilizations under their control with sheer force. But this son combined all of these qualities with something far more dangerous, the ability to shape minds without appearing to challenge authority. He worked within constraints, adapted to limits, and thrived under restrictions, all while advancing a vision that subtly eroded the Emperor's monopoly over humanity's future. The Emperor recognized this immediately. Where Horus felt a pride, Angron to rage, and Lorgar to fanaticism, this son was disciplined, rational, and principled. His victories were not spectacular, they were enduring. His influence was not overt, it was persistent. And in every calculation the emperor ran, he could not determine a future in which this Primarch did not play a decisive, independent role. The fear this inspired was not rooted in anger or jealousy. It was existential. The emperor understood that humanity's loyalty, once inspired by understanding rather than compulsion, could not be controlled. The Primarch's methods were subtle, but the consequences were profound. One day, generations from now, humanity might look at the Imperium not as a God-given authority, but as a system that could be improved, refined, and eventually surpassed. And in that moment, the Emperor's centuries of guidance, all his planning and foresight, would no longer be necessary. He feared not the loss of control, but obsolescence. Because this was no ordinary son, no mere extension of his will. This was a Primarch whose quiet reasoning and principled actions hinted at a future where the Emperor himself might be unnecessary. A son who could, without lifting a sword or issuing a command, change the trajectory of the galaxy. And in the Emperor's infinite vision, there was no weapon, no legion, and no strategy capable of erasing the inevitability this son represented. The realization settled on the Emperor like a shadow he could not dispel, that the greatest threat to his rule was not open defiance. It was this calm, deliberate, quietly revolutionary son, whose very existence posed the question the Emperor could not answer: what happens when humanity no longer needs its God? The Emperor had faced countless threats over the millennia: alien empires that sought humanity's annihilation, the seductive corruption of the warp, legions of traitors, and even his own flawed sons. Each challenge, no matter how immense, could be confronted, planned for, or corrected with strategy, force, or foresight. But this Primarch presented a problem that could not be countered in conventional ways. He did not rebel openly. He did not seek power for himself. He simply made the galaxy better, on principles that the Emperor could not wholly control. It was the subtlety of the threat that terrified him. Other Primarchs had flaws he could exploit: anger, pride, loyalty to friends over orders, but this son had mastered restraint. He operated with precision, insight, and ethical clarity. He adhered to duty while expanding influence, all without crossing the boundaries of obedience. Where others relied on fear, intimidation, or spectacle, he relied on reason, persuasion, and example. And in doing so, he created something the Emperor could neither dominate nor predict: a model of leadership that did not require gods. Every victory he achieved, every civilization he nurtured, every mind he influenced became a testament not to force, but to understanding. And the more he succeeded, the clearer it became that the Emperor's authority over the future was not absolute. The son was shaping humanity not as a puppet, but as an active participant in its own destiny. The Emperor's centuries of planning, his intricate designs for the Great Crusade, and his visions of the Imperium's eventual triumph, all of it could be challenged, subtly, by the mere act of thoughtful guidance. The Emperor's fear was no longer abstract. He saw the trajectory of influence stretching outward, quietly and inexorably. Where chaos spread through corruption and temptation, this Primarch spread stability, thoughtfulness, and reason. Where Horus inspired loyalty through heroism and eventual betrayal, this son inspired loyalty through understanding. And unlike rebellion, this influence could not be crushed by force. It was patient, it was quiet, it endured. The Emperor began to adjust. Subtle restrictions, redirections, and reassignments became part of his silent strategy. Campaigns were shifted, resources carefully allocated elsewhere, recognition was delayed. It was not punishment, for this son had done nothing wrong. It was containment, an attempt to limit the scope of a mind that might otherwise reshape the galaxy beyond the Emperor's vision. Yet every intervention was met with ingenuity. The Primarch adapted, finding ways to achieve his objectives while remaining within the imposed constraints. He did not resist, he did not rebel. He simply continued, and in doing so, demonstrated a terrifying truth. The power to shape the future does not require open defiance. Sometimes, it is enough to simply act wisely, patiently, and consistently.